All right. So what we're going to do here is talk about infancy and childhood. So when we say infancy, we're typically referring to the first year of life. And then early and middle childhood are everything up to puberty. Now, we could subdivide this further: infancy, toddlerhood. Now, toddlerhood is roughly about 1 year old to 3 years old. Preschool is roughly 3 to 5 years old. And that kind of is the early part of childhood. And middle childhood is from when you enter school, that's roughly 5 or 6, until about 12, which is when you hit puberty. So even though I have these terms, they really can be further divided or further explained. And what we're going to do is we're going to focus on different um, skills that are acquired and aspects of development that occur during infancy and childhood. And as I mentioned, there are three general domains that we look at for development, which can be really subdivided into 5 bullet points, even though I have 4 here. We have the physical aspect of development. We have the cognitive aspect of development, which would include language development. And then we have the social and emotional aspect of development, right? So there are 5, but we say physical, cognitive, socio emotional. And what we do is we look at the changes that are occurring across each of these. So let's start with physical development. And then I'm going to stop the recording there. I'll give you a break and then we'll get into Piaget, because Piaget is a longer piece of the lecture, and that's cognitive development. All right. So let's talk about physical development. If we were to look at brain development, we have roughly 250,000 neurons being created per minute in utero on average. And at birth, you're going to have the most amount of neurons that you will have across your lifespan. Now, why do I say that? Because there's going to be a process of getting rid of excess neuronal connections. There's going to be a process of getting rid of unused neurons as a whole, right? So after you create the neurons, we have to make pathways. We have to make synaptic connections. So the synaptic connections that are being used, they are going to maintain themselves. But what about the synaptic connections that are not being used? Well, we get rid of them. So we have some redundancy, but we don't need an excess amount of redundancy. So unused synaptic connection are eliminated, which we refer to as synaptic pruning. What about the cells themselves, right? So when we talk about the cells as a whole, we also have something called programmed cell death, right? So apoptosis is a process of saying, okay, this neuron, this cell was unnecessary. It's not being used. Therefore, I'm going to get rid of the cell as a whole as well. Now, if you look on the right, what you're looking at is the connections being made between neurons. Now, the branches, right, the long extensions or axons, the center is a soma, and then on this side are your dendrites. But you'll notice as we progress through age, from birth to 3 months and then 3 months to 15 months, we are creating a more intricate, interwoven communication system between neurons, right? So it's very scarce at birth, and then it becomes more intricate, pardon me, as we progress. So it's a pretty cool system, and that's the process of how neurons, you know, communicate and develop those pathways. A way of thinking about this might be thinking about driving. So if you drive, whether it be from school to home or work to home, if I were to ask you, well, how do you get to school or how do you get to work? You would give me uh, your path. You would say, well, at first I, go to the end of the corner, I make a right, I hop on the highway, blah, 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 right? You would give me a very clear depiction. And then if I were to say, okay, now what would happen if you had a detour? So you couldn't use that path. You would say, oh, that's simple. I would use this alternate path, blah, blah, blah. And okay, now there's a detail on your alternate path. Then you would say, well, there's this third path. But similar to neurons, there is some redundancy. There's the direct path, there might be other paths, but at a certain point, the connection between the neurons is unused, right? So or so rarely used that it's pruned out. So um, that's basically the case with neurons. We also have uh, maturation, which is a term for biological growth. So it tends to occur in an orderly fashion. And if there's some kind of trauma or abuse or malnutrition or deprivation, it could affect natural biological growth process. In terms of memory, we tend to see that the earliest memories occur at roughly 3 years old. That isn't to say that some people don't have uh, select distinct memories before that. But on average, if you were to ask, well, okay, what's your earliest memory? Typically, it's around 3 years old, which is linked to the relationship between that neuronal growth and the synaptic pruning. So those earlier memories before the age of 3 are pruned out oftentimes, so you may not remember it. For example, if I were to ask you to describe when you took your first step, well, most of you are going to say, well, I don't remember when I took my first step. And that's true because it usually happens around 1 year old, right? So uh, you may not have a distinct memory. And it's a motor memory. So it's not something that you forgot how to do it. It's just you forgot the learning process of acquiring it. So between these synaptic connections and pruning, we have our earliest memories roughly the age of 3. We also have motor development. Now, motor development, this is only in infancy. What we tend to see is the first thing that happens is a child will learn to roll over. So if you put a child on their back, they will eventually acquire the ability to roll over. The first time this happens, you might be shocked, but then from rolling over, they might learn to sit up. They might learn to do what's called commando crawling or creeping on all fours. Then they might crawl in a general crawling sense. That's about roughly 6 months that kids learn to crawl. And then you have something between crawling and walking, which is called cruising. So before an infant can walk independently, they might walk using furniture as an aid. So you might see the child pull themselves up and walk along a coffee table. And then when there's no longer the coffee table, they fall down, or walk along a bookshelf. And then when they don't have the support, they fall down. That's usually around 9, 10 months. And our first step is roughly on average about 12 months. Now, there are cultural variations in motor development in societies where there is a conscious effort to teach children to walk, such as in Jamaica and in Nigeria, walking tends to occur earlier. There are also societies, there are indigenous populations in Mexico and in Central Asia where they actually restrict walking. So they dissuade walking because they're afraid the child might get hurt. Or in the case of Central Asia, you might have the child strapped into a bassinet. Well, that's going to um, stunt the process of walking. So these individuals are going to walk later. In other societies like the United States, we don't push walking, but we don't dissuade it either. It's kind of, we let you develop naturally. And in Western societies like the United States, there's kind of this midpoint of learning to walk, which is roughly about 1 year old. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to give you your break. And then on the flip side, we'll talk about cognitive development.